The Universal Celebration Registry lists more human holidays than any species combined. Part 1. I had worked at the Galactic Census Bureau for 12 years. In all that time, she had never found an error she could not explain. Numbers made sense to her. They followed rules. They behaved in predictable ways. That was why she loved her job as an archivist. Every species in the Federation submitted their data and organized it into neat, orderly records that would last for thousands of years. Today, however, the numbers were not making sense. She sat at her workstation in the massive archive chamber, surrounded by floating displays that showed data from across the galaxy. The Universal Celebration Registry was due for its annual update, and had been tasked with compiling the final counts. It should have been simple work. Add up the holidays, check them against last year's numbers, note any changes. She had done this task many times before. But the human entry was wrong. It had to be wrong. I pulled up the data again and let her 4 eyes scan across the figures. Humans had joined the Galactic Federation 187 years ago. They were a young species by any measure. They had only spread to 17 star systems so far, a modest number compared to the great civilizations that span thousands of worlds. Their total population was barely 40 billion, which was smaller than some single planets in the Federation. And yet, according to the registry, humans had submitted 847 official holidays. I checked the number 3 more times. She ran a diagnostic on her display equipment. She even accessed the raw data files directly, bypassing all the processing systems that might have introduced errors. The number remained the same, 847. For comparison, she pulled up the entry for the collective. They were one of the oldest civilizations in known space. They had been building starships when humans were still learning to make fire. Their empire stretched across 4,000 worlds and had existed for 12 billion years. In all that vast time, across all those countless worlds, they had accumulated 203 holidays. The crystalline beings of the hegemony of, who had achieved faster-than-light travel before most species had evolved eyes, celebrated 67 holidays. The A's own people observed 34 sacred days throughout their year. Even the 1,000 minds of a hive species that experienced time differently than most organic beings only recognized 112 significant celebrations. Humans had more holidays than all of them combined. I saved her work and rose from her station. Her supervisor needed to see this immediately. Had been the senior archivist of the Galactic Census Bureau for 600 years. The ancient had seen empires rise and fall, had the birth of new species and the quiet extinction of old ones. Very little surprised anymore. But when I presented the human holiday data, the old archivist's secondary eyes widened slightly, which was the equivalent of complete shock. "You have this?" asked, their voice carrying the slow, measured tones of someone who had learned patience across centuries. "Multiple times," I confirmed. "The data is accurate. Humans really do have 847 registered holidays." Was quiet for a long moment. Then they made a sound that I had never heard before, something between a cough and a wheeze. It took her a moment to realize that was laughing. "I should have expected this," the old archivist said. "I processed their initial submission when they joined the Federation. Even then, the numbers were unusual. I assumed they would consolidate over time, as all species do. It seems I was mistaken." "Should we flag this as an anomaly?" I asked. "Perhaps request clarification from the human delegation." "An excellent idea," agreed. "I am curious to hear how they explain themselves." The human cultural arrived at the Census Bureau 3 days later. Ambassador was a small woman with dark hair and bright eyes that seemed to find everything around her interesting. She walked through the ancient archive halls with the casual confidence of someone who was comfortable anywhere, even in a building older than her entire species. She was also carrying a box. "I brought gifts," she announced cheerfully when she reached A's workstation. Moon cakes. It's the Mid-Autumn Festival back on Earth, and we always share food during holidays. Please help yourselves. I accepted one of the small pastries uncertainly. It was dense and sweet, filled with something she could not identify. Ambassador explained that it was lotus seed paste, made from a plant that grew in Earth's wetlands. The recipe was over 1,000 years old. 1,000 years, I repeated, and you still celebrate this festival. Of course, said, as if this was the most natural thing in the galaxy. The Mid-Autumn Festival is about family and togetherness. People look at the moon and think about their loved ones who might be far away. That feeling doesn't change just because we've spread to other planets. If anything, it matters more now. This was precisely the kind of answer I had been hoping to avoid. It was emotional rather than logical, sentimental rather than practical. It explained nothing about why humans had 4 times as many holidays as a civilization that had existed for 12 billion years. Ambassador, she said carefully, I asked you here because of an anomaly in our records. According to the Universal Celebration Registry, your species has submitted 847 official holidays. Nodded, that sounds about right. The collective has 203. Well, they are very efficient, said. I've always admired that about them. You do not find this disparity unusual. The ambassador considered the question. She took a bite of her own moon cake, chewing thoughtfully. When she spoke again, her tone was more serious than before. May I see the list? I pulled up the human holiday registry and projected it between them. Hundreds of entries scrolled past, each one with its name, origin, date, and basic description. Watched them go by with an expression that I could not read. Groundhog Day, the ambassador said softly, pointing to one entry. That's when a small furry animal supposedly predicts the weather. Valentine's Day, when we celebrate romantic love. Day, when everyone pretends to be Irish. Talk like a pirate day, which is exactly what it sounds like. She continued scrolling. We have multiple New Year's celebrations because different cultures use different calendars. We have Independence Days for nations that don't exist anymore because the people who came from those nations still remember them. We have holidays for specific foods, for specific historical figures, for events that happened so long ago that we've forgotten why we celebrate them in the first place. I waited for the explanation, but had fallen silent. She was looking at the list with that unreadable expression again, her eyes moving across the names of celebrations that stretched back thousands of years. You think this is strange, the ambassador finally said. It was not a question. I think it is statistically improbable, I admitted. They have had 12 billion years to accumulate holidays. You have had perhaps 10,000 years of recorded civilization. The mathematics do not support this outcome. Laughed, but it was a gentle sound, not mocking. She set down her moon cake and turned to face it directly. Can I tell you something about humans? Nodded. We figured out very early that life is short, said. And not just short, but often painful. We get sick. We hurt each other. We lose the people we love. The universe is very large and very old and does not particularly care whether we exist or not. We understood this when we were still living in caves, and we've never forgotten it. She gestured at the list of holidays still floating between them. So we decided to celebrate anyway, every chance we got, every excuse we could find. Because if existence is brief and often painful, then joy is precious. And precious things are worth protecting, worth remembering, worth setting aside special days to honor. The ambassador smiled, and I finally recognized the expression she had seen earlier. It was fondness, deep, genuine affection for something that mattered. You want to understand why we have so many holidays? Asked. It's because we never stopped looking for reasons to be happy together, and we never threw any of them away. Part 2. Ambassador offered to show us something. The archivist had more questions, hundreds of them, but insisted that some things could not be explained with words alone. They had to be experienced. They traveled from the ancient archive halls to the newer sections of the orbital platform, where different species maintained their own habitat rings. The human section was smaller than most, a modest curve of corridors and chambers designed to feel like a place called home. As they approached, I began to notice something unusual. The air smelled different, rich and warm and complicated, full of scents that I could not identify. There was music too, but not one kind of music. Multiple melodies competed and overlapped, coming from different directions, played on instruments that sounded nothing alike. And everywhere there were lights. Strings of small glowing objects hung from doorways and ceilings. Candles flickered in windows. Lanterns in every color swayed gently in the recycled air. Some of the lights were electric, some were flame, and some seemed to be made from paper and wire, glowing from within like captured stars. "We have 3 celebrations happening at the same time today," explained as they walked. Diwali, which is a festival of lights from a place called India. Los, which honors our dead and comes from Mexico. And something called Friendsgiving, which is a newer tradition where people who can't be with their families gather together and pretend to be family instead. I tried to process this information. "You are celebrating 3 holidays simultaneously." "It happens more often than you'd think," said. "When you have 847 holidays, there's a lot of overlap." They turned a corner and entered what called the common area. It was a large open space that had been transformed. Part of it was decorated with intricate patterns made from colored powder on the floor, surrounding small oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on the walls. Another section held long tables covered with photographs, flowers, candles, and objects that it did not recognize. A third area was dominated by a massive wooden table piled high with food. Humans were everywhere. Some were kneeling by the oil lamps, lighting new ones and arranging them in careful patterns. Others stood before the photograph-covered tables, speaking softly to pictures of people who were clearly no longer alive. A large group surrounded the wooden table, arguing with obvious affection about something called stuffing, and whether it belonged inside or outside of something called a turkey. "What you're seeing," said, "is what humans do. We build rituals around the things that matter to us. Light in the darkness, memory of those we've lost, food shared with people we love. Different cultures found different ways to express these ideas, but the core is always the same." A small child ran past them, carrying a paper lantern painted with stars and moons. The child was laughing, chased by an older boy who was pretending to be some kind of monster. An elderly woman called after them to be careful, but she was smiling. "They consolidated their celebrations," I said slowly. "They had 12 billion years of history, and they reduced it to 203 efficient observances that captured the essential meanings without unnecessary repetition." "Yes," agreed, "they're very practical about it. Humans have not done this. No, we've done the opposite." Led to a quiet corner where they could talk without shouting over the music. They sat on cushions near a window that looked out at the stars. "When humans achieved," began, "there was a lot of debate about what we should bring with us. We couldn't take everything. We had to make choices about what mattered enough to preserve. Some people argued that we should do what they did: consolidate, simplify, create a unified human culture that would be efficient and logical and easy to maintain." "That would have been sensible," I observed. "It would have," agreed. "But it didn't happen. Instead, we brought everything. Every holiday, every tradition, every recipe and song and story that any culture had ever created. We carried it all into space with us, and we kept celebrating all of it." "Why?" Was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. "Because we knew what it cost to lose things. Human history is full of cultures that were destroyed, traditions that were forbidden, languages that were silenced. Every time that happened, we lost something that could never be recovered. the songs that grandmothers sang the recipes that had been passed down for generations, the holidays that gave meaning to the passage of time. Once they were gone forever. She nodded toward the celebration happening around them. So when we went to the stars, we made a promise to ourselves. We would not let that happen again. We would not consolidate or simplify or throw anything away. Every holiday that any human culture had ever celebrated would be preserved, protected, and passed on to future generations. Not because they were all equally important, but because we had learned that you never know what will matter until it's too late. A thought about this. In the archive chamber, she worked with records that stretched back millions of years. She had seen the gaps where information had been lost, the empty spaces where knowledge had once existed before being forgotten. The valued preservation above almost everything else because they understood that time was hungry and always feeding. But they preserved facts, data, objective information that could be and stored. Humans, it seemed, were trying to preserve something else entirely. The first Mars colony created a new holiday within their first year, continued. They called it Landing Day. It commemorated the moment when humans first set foot on another world. A few decades later, when the terraforming was finished and rain fell on Mars for the first time in millions of years, they created First Rain Day. When a shipping accident stranded a group of workers for 2 weeks with nothing but emergency rations, the survivors created Perseverance Week. They still celebrate it every year, eating terrible freeze-dried food and telling jokes about how bad things were. They celebrate a disaster. They celebrate surviving the disaster. There's a difference. An older man approached them carrying 2 cups of something hot and fragrant. He offered one too, and after a moment of hesitation, one too. The archivist accepted it carefully, wrapping her fingers around the warm container. Chai explained. A spiced tea from India. It's traditional to offer it to guests during Diwali. A sipped the drink. It was sweet and complex, with flavors she had never encountered before. Around her, the celebration continued. Someone had started singing, and others were joining in, their voices rising together in a melody that was obviously old but still full of life. Do humans not find this exhausting? I asked. Maintaining so many celebrations, remembering so many traditions. Laughed. Sometimes, yes. Keeping track of everything is a lot of work, but the alternative is worse. The alternative is forgetting. And humans have learned that forgetting is a kind of death. When no one remembers a holiday anymore, when the last person who celebrated it is gone, something real disappears from the universe. A way of being happy together that will never exist again. She gestured at the room around them. Everyone here is making memories, not just for themselves, but for the people who come after them. Someday the children running around with lanterns will be old, and they will teach their own children how to celebrate Diwali and Lowe's and Friendsgiving. And those children will teach their children. And the chain will continue, stretching forward into a future we can't even imagine. I watched a young woman carefully placing a photograph on one of the decorated tables. The picture showed an older man with a kind smile. The young woman was crying, but she was also smiling, speaking softly to the image as if the man could hear her. That's her grandfather, said quietly. He died last year. Lowe's teaches us that the dead are not truly gone as long as we remember them. So every year she builds an altar for him. She puts out his favorite foods. She tells him about her life. She keeps him alive in the only way that matters. The archivist said nothing. She was beginning to understand something that the numbers had never shown her. Humans did not have 847 holidays because they were inefficient or disorganized or incapable of prioritizing. They had 847 holidays because they had decided, as a species, that joy was worth fighting for, that memory was worth preserving, that no moment of happiness was too small to celebrate or too old to remember. They were not celebrating despite their suffering. They were celebrating because of it. Part 3. A return to the archive chamber late that night. The celebrations in the human habitat were still going strong, but she had work to do. Her mind was full of new ideas, and she needed to think. The Universal Celebration Registry floated before her, its millions of entries organized by species, by date, by category. For 12 years, she had viewed this document as a simple record, a list of facts to be and preserved. Now she saw something different. Every entry represented a choice, a moment when a civilization had decided that something mattered enough to set aside time for it, a moment when individuals had come together and agreed that this day, this event, this idea was worth remembering. The registry was not just a list, it was a map of meaning, a record of how different species had chosen to define what made life worthwhile. She began cross-referencing the human entries with their historical data. The archive contained information about human history stretching back thousands of years, covering their wars and discoveries and cultural developments. As she worked, patterns began to emerge. Human holidays were not random. They followed the shape of human needs. When early humans had survived another harvest, they created festivals of thanksgiving. When the long dark winters threatened to break their spirits, they created celebrations of light and warmth. When beloved people died, they created rituals to honor their memories. When children needed to learn important lessons, they created holidays that taught through joy rather than fear. And most remarkably, these holidays had evolved. They had merged and separated and changed over time, adapting to new circumstances while preserving their essential meanings. A winter celebration from one culture had blended with traditions from another, creating something new that belonged to both. A regional festival had spread across continents and then across worlds, picking up local variations at every stop. Nothing was fixed. Nothing was final. The holidays were alive, in a way that archives usually were not. I found herself thinking about the collective and their 203 celebrations. They had lived for 12 billion years. They had seen stars born and die. They had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations beyond counting, and they had reduced all of that vast experience to a carefully curated set of observances, each one chosen for its efficiency and significance. It was an impressive achievement, but it was also a kind of loss. For every holiday they had kept, how many had they discarded? How many moments of joy had been deemed redundant, merged with others, or simply forgotten? The approach preserved meaning, but it sacrificed variety. It kept the important things, but lost the small things. And perhaps the small things mattered too. Humans had taken the opposite approach. They kept everything. They accepted redundancy and overlap and inefficiency because they believed that every celebration had value, even if that value was not obvious. They trusted that future generations would figure out what mattered and what didn't, rather than making those decisions in advance. It was chaotic, it was impractical. It was also, I was beginning to think, wise. She worked through the night, pulling up records and making connections. By the time the station's artificial dawn began to brighten the archive chamber, she had assembled something that surprised her. It was not just a report explaining the statistical anomaly. It was an argument. Found her still working when the senior archivist arrived for the morning shift. The old paused at the entrance to A's workstation, their secondary eyes narrowing as they observed the dozens of displays floating around her. "You did not sleep," observed. "I discovered something important," A replied. She showed what she had found, the patterns in human celebrations, the ways they preserved memory and created meaning, the philosophy that seemed to underlie all of it, that joy was fragile and precious and worth protecting at any cost. Listened in silence, which was their way. When I finished, the old archivist was quiet for a long time. "You believe this is significant," finally said. "I believe we are missing something," A replied. The Universal Celebration Registry is supposed to preserve information about how species mark the passage of time, but we only count the holidays. We do not ask why they exist, or what they mean to the people who celebrate them, or what would be lost if they were forgotten. That is beyond our mandate. Perhaps our mandate is too narrow. It was a bold thing to say to a supervisor who had been doing this work for 600 years, but did not seem offended. Instead, the old archivist made that strange coughing sound again, the one that I now recognized as laughter. I have wondered this myself, admitted. For centuries, I have celebrations without ever truly considering their purpose. They were data points to be recorded. I did not think to ask what they revealed about the species that created them. I felt something warm in her chest. It was validation, she realized. The recognition that her strange new ideas had value. I would like to propose something, she said carefully. A new approach to the registry, not just counting holidays but understanding them, documenting what they mean and why they matter, creating a record that preserves not just the facts but the spirit behind them. Considered this, it would be a great deal of work. Yes, it would require us to engage with cultures in ways we never have before. Yes, it might fundamentally change how the Census Bureau operates. Yes. The old archivist was quiet for another long moment, then did something that surprised her more than anything else that had happened in the past 3 days. They smiled. I think, said slowly, that we should create a holiday. I stared at her supervisor. A holiday. For the Bureau. A day when we pause our work and appreciate what we preserve. A celebration of the collected joy of 1,000 species, the accumulated evidence that sentient beings, wherever they arise, find reasons to light candles against the dark. It was not something I had ever considered. The Census Bureau was an institution, not a culture. It existed to record information, not to create traditions. And yet, as she thought about it, the idea made a strange kind of sense. They spent their lives preserving the celebrations of others. Why should they not have a celebration of their own? What would we call it? She asked. Registry Day, replied. Simple, appropriate, easy to remember. I liked it. She liked it very much. They drafted the proposal together, working through the morning and into the afternoon. It was unusual work for archivists, but it felt right. When they finished, they submitted it to the Bureau's governing council. The approval came 3 days later. Registry Day would be added to the Bureau's calendar, to be observed annually by all staff across all facilities. It was a small thing, really. One new holiday among the millions that already existed, but it was theirs. Ambassador heard about it somehow. Humans always seem to hear about things. She arrived at the archive chamber the day after the approval, carrying another box of food that she explained were celebration cookies. We would like to add Registry Day to our calendar, she announced, if that's acceptable. I was confused. It's a Bureau holiday. It has nothing to do with humans. It celebrates the preservation of celebrations, replied. That's basically what we've been doing since we invented fire. Of course we want to be part of it. She set down the cookies and pulled out her tablet. I've already submitted the paperwork. This brings our total to 848. And if you're wondering, we're planning a party. There will be cake and probably some kind of parade and definitely too much singing. You do not even know when the holiday will be observed. Doesn't matter, we'll figure out the date later. The important thing is that we said yes, that we decided this mattered enough to celebrate, smiled. That's always the important thing. I looked at the ambassador, then at the archive chamber around them, then at the floating displays that contained the holidays of 1,000 species. She thought about the oil lamps of Diwali, the altars of Lowe's, the feast of Friendsgiving. She thought about Landing Day and First Rain Day and Perseverance Week. She thought about every moment of joy that humans had ever carved out of a universe that did not owe them anything. And then she did something she had never done before. She submitted a personal leave request. There will be a celebration in the human habitat, she told when the old archivist asked about the request. "For Registry Day, they have invited bureau staff to attend." Secondary eyes widened slightly. "You wish to go?" "I wish to understand," A replied. "And I think the best way to understand a holiday is to celebrate it." The old archivist was quiet for a moment. Then they made the coughing laughing sound again and submitted their own leave request. "I have been celebrations for 600 years, said. "Perhaps it is time I participated in one." The party was exactly as Ambassador had described. There was cake, far too much of it, in more flavors than I had known existed. There was a parade of sorts, a procession through the habitat corridors with music and banners and children carrying handmade signs that said things like "Yay Records" and "ARCHIVES are cool." There was singing, so much singing, in languages and styles that clashed and harmonized in equal measure. And there was joy. That was the thing I noticed most of all. The humans were genuinely happy to be there, happy to be celebrating something, happy to share that happiness with anyone who wanted to join them. They welcomed the archivists into their celebration as if they had always belonged, offering food and drink and invitations to dance. I did not dance, but she watched, and she listened, and she understood finally why humans had 848 holidays. It was not about efficiency or logic or practicality. It was about choosing to be happy, choosing to find reasons for joy even when the universe provided reasons for despair, choosing to preserve every moment of light because the darkness was always waiting. The Universal Celebration Registry would continue to grow. New holidays would be added every year, from humans and from other species inspired by their example. The numbers would become even more statistically improbable. And I, who had spent her life organizing data into neat and orderly records, would learn to see the beautiful chaos in all of it. Because in the end, the numbers were not what mattered. What mattered was the meaning behind them, the love and loss and hope and memory that every holiday represented. The choice, made again and again across all of time and space, to celebrate being alive. 848 holidays, and counting. The humans would never stop finding reasons to be happy together. And perhaps, a thought as she watched the celebration swirl around her, that was the most human thing of all.